Righty, thank you everyone for coming in person today. Given the weather outside, I know it's not the easiest thing sometimes, but welcome back to Dyson House and the Australian Institute of International Affairs, Victoria. Today, to begin, I'll just start by acknowledging and paying tribute to traditional owners of the land, both elders past, present, and emerging. And with that, we'll jump straight into our event. I know there's a couple of people still pouring in, but please come join us. And also welcome to our Zoom audience who's also joining us. We'll get to it. So today we're going to be talking on the state of Russian opposition in 2023. Obviously, given the invasion of Ukraine, which saw quite an outbreak of protests in Russia and potentially raise hopes that the Russian people might be able to rise up in popular protests against the war. But unfortunately, those hopes to date have not been fulfilled. Instead, leading opposition leaders have been imprisoned or exiled, and with legitimate political opposition to Putin's rule effectively outlawed. Does internal resistance to Putin's regime still matter, and who can be considered Putin's political opposition, and what is the current and potential role of leading political figures in the anti-war resistance movement? So to discuss these sort of questions, we have three panelists joining us today. Dr. Robert HORVATH, Associate Professor William Pratt, and Peter KUZMIN. Dr. HORVATH is a specialist in Russian politics at La Trobe University, and his current research preoccupations include Putin's regime, manipulation of Russian nationalism, and its assaults on the international human rights institutions and its intervention in Africa. Associate Professor William Pratt's work is an associate professor at the Melbourne Law School, has traveled extensively in Russia and the former Soviet Union, and his insight draws on both his training in Russian politics, language, and history at the University of Oxford and Princeton University. Peter KUZMIN, who is also joining our panel this evening, is a Russian-Australian anti-war activist and a vocal critic of Putin's regime within the Russian-speaking community of Australia, and is one of the founders of the Sloboda Alliance, a pro-democracy human rights pro-democracy community organization focused on promoting universal human rights and political freedoms in Russia. And he's also a longtime supporter of Alexei Navalny and his anti-corruption foundation, which I suspect we'll hear a bit about this evening. So I'm going to pass over to our panel and all the best.
Thank you, Jacob. Thank you, Jacob, and thank you to the Australian Institute of International Affairs for hosting this event. It's a privilege, and I'm very grateful for this opportunity. So to begin today's discussion, would like to start with this question of whether the Russian opposition in 2023 still matters. We don't see large-scale protests. All the leaders of the opposition movement are either jailed, like Alexei Navalny, Ilya Yashin, Yevgeny Rozman, or they are in exile, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, Garry Kasparov, etc. So does the opposition still matter in the absence of public protests? And we see that official opinion polls are showing still high levels of support for Vladimir Putin and the war. William, maybe we'll start with you.
That working now? Yes. All right. The key context to understand why we're not seeing the kind of mass protests that some people expected, some people are calling for, and so forth, is we have to understand the legal impediments to protest in Russia since the 24th of February, and how aggressively the state has moved to prosecute individuals who themselves are engaged in any form of of opposition to the war in any limited form. So just give you some numbers from HORVATH Info, which is doing some really good work at the moment. At the moment, there have been 19,586 people arrested since the 24th of February last year. There are just next week 81 cases pending on political charges. Since last March, so over the last year, there are now 3 new parts of Russian law, which actually make what they call discrediting the use of the armed forces of the Russian Federation an administrative offense, a criminal offense, and a significant criminal offense, which could land you 10 years in prison. So there has been a concerted effort by the regime to bring into effect a series of really, really strict laws that make it very difficult for individuals to protest. So I think we have to understand what's happening in the kind of the quote unquote silence we see in Russia in that context. Just to give you one example, a 13-year-old schoolgirl named Maria Moskaliova in a little village called Yefremov, just in the Tulska Oblast, near Tula and south of Moscow, was asked in her class to, they were drawing, this is now increasingly being introduced into schools in Russia, they draw a picture that supports the war and supports the heroes of the Donbass. And she was opposed to the war and wrote, and actually drew a kind of Ukrainian flag and said, I'm against war. Her father has subsequently been charged and is facing 30 years in prison for the actions of his daughter. She has now been placed in an orphanage. And there is significant questions about what her future is. Her father is the only carer. Her mother is not present, so she could be living the rest of her, kind of child life in an orphanage. So we get a sense of how aggressively this is being pursued by the authorities, and I think we have to understand why some of the silence or the lack of protest in light of the significant consequences, both legal and, as we can see here, the state intervening in people's lives, taking away children, doing all kinds of things that have really significant effects on people's lives. And then just quickly to mention polling. Now, there are polls out there that show, I think one that came out today, 77% support for the war amongst the Russian population. Now, we need to be very careful with this, and I know Robert's going to speak to this as well. I'm just going to say that one of the key things, there's some really interesting work being done by sociologists, independent sociologists in Russia, saying, look at the way that these polling questions are asked. They're asked in certain ways that frame the conclusion so that the individual getting that phone call, picking up the phone, is very unlikely to say anything that might actually be negative about the war. Maybe they're going to they're afraid they're going to get prosecuted, right? Because at this point, the polling organizations are either state-owned or state-controlled pseudo-state institutions. Pretty much in a time of war like this in Russia, pretty much everything is under the control of the state. So we can understand a little bit why, 77% support. This is not a number we should be relying on. And I do encourage my friends in journalism and other ones to not cite these things. We often see this with, Putin has this broad-based support. Do we really believe that? Can we believe it? And can we particularly believe the support for the war now? So I think those are at least 2 contextual ways for us to begin to understand a little bit about why, we're seeing this silence in the context for this silence, and why we might want to think about the importance of an opposition, because there is potentially underlying all of this supposed stability and support for the war, actually a lot of distrust for the state and a lot of actually unhappiness about the war. So we'll turn it over.
There's actually another question that I want to ask. One of the common narratives about this war is that it's not just Putin's war, it's Russia's war. And there's a belief, at least in some parts of the Western commentary, that the imperial attitudes of the Russian population are still very strong, and they're present also in the opposition leaders themselves. And some people go as far as saying that any other, even an opposition leader, is not likely to be much better than Putin. The imperial tendencies are too strong, and any future leader is likely to continue along the same path. What do you think about this, Robert?
Thanks. this is an idea that is out there, and on social media, it is massive. A lot of it's been focused on the figure of Alexei Navalny. Unsurprisingly, he embodies the idea of a peaceful Russia, a democratic Russia, a Russia that is not a threat to its neighbors. And today, there's basically a maelstrom of hatred directed at Navalny, some of which comes from the Kremlin's trolling factories, which love this kind of thing. Kremlin trolling factories promote any idea that is going to cause division and disruption and undermine its enemies. But a lot of it is coming from Ukraine and Ukrainian communities around the world, for whom this has become an identity issue. They are identifying themselves with the anti-Navalny cause. They are identifying Navalny as the embodiment of everything that they hate about Russia, and they are often arguing that a Russia under Navalny would be worse than a Russia under Putin. This claim is so far from reality that it is Orwellian. What we can see in Navalny's evolution over the past 10 years is a movement from a position of moderate liberal nationalism to one that is increasingly hostile to any manifestation of Russian imperialism. And in his statements since the war began, from prison where he's being tortured, he called on Russians to demonstrate against the war and to fill up Russian prisons. Now, to say that if you're a Russian exile is actually quite brave, because the Putin regime's tentacles reach far. To say that when you're in a prison where you're being tortured, it is a demonstration of courage and principle that should have been appreciated by those he was trying to help. Since then, he's called for a fundamental restructuring of the Russian state. In a programmatic article that was published by the Washington Post, he argued that Russia needed to undergo a transition from a presidential to a parliamentary system, because that would make it harder for a leader like Putin to start using aggressive nationalism for his own purposes. The idea that the Russian opposition could possibly be worse than Putin, or in any way is anything more than the antithesis of almost everything that Putin stands for, is demonstrably false. But it is an argument that does serve the interests of the Putin regime. I just say quickly that there are three things about the Russian opposition today, apart from the specific case of Navalny, that are significant. The first is that it has been defined by opposition to Putinism. It's been defined by opposition to his corruption. It's been defined by opposition to dictatorship and authoritarianism. There's a fundamental divide that flows from that. The second thing is that the opposition is defined by its opposition to Putin's war with Ukraine. Everyone in the opposition who matters has spoken out very loudly against the war. And the third thing that really deserves reflection is there's an existential divide between the Putin regime and the Russian opposition. The Putin regime is made up by a group of largely opportunists who have extracted a lot of money for their personal use from the Russian state. This is high-level systemic corruption. That is what Putin's kleptocracy is founded upon. The Russian opposition, by contrast, is people who've suffered. They've been beaten up at demonstrations. They've faced fraudulent criminal charges. Their families have been harassed. They've been beaten up. Some of them have been murdered. Many of them have faced months or years in prison. And that's a defining experience. When you've endured that much persecution because of something you stand for, you are on the other side of the barricades to the oppressive and kleptocratic regime that you're opposing. So no, the Russian opposition is not worse than Putin. It offers the only way out of Putinism.
Thank you, Robert. It's very encouraging to hear that you are saying these words. It's something that I deeply believe in, but I'm happy that it's recognized in the West as well. Maybe we can spend a couple of minutes looking at who we include in the term Russian opposition. In Western countries, we talk about opposition as parties that are in parliament, that are in opposition to the government. In Russia, Putin's regime has really made it practically impossible to legally be in opposition to the regime. So, Robert, maybe or William, can you start? Can you give your definition of the opposition in Russia?
Well, so let me just start, because I know that we're gonna go in steps about how we describe. So I'm going to just start with what's called the kind of systematic opposition. And for those of you who understand kind of socialist or communist practice in China today, this is a very loyal opposition, right? These are like what we have in China today, they call them the 8 dwarves. I think, these are political parties that are largely kind of very supportive of the Kremlin, supportive of Putin, but formally are the opposition. Now, why should we talk about them? Because I do think there are some younger members of these parties who might play a role in a future opposition or in a future Russia. So we have to look at them. And there's two main parties that I want to talk about. The first is the Communist Party of the Russian Federation. During the 1990s, they were the serious opposition to Yeltsin and to Yeltsin and his team. Since 2000, they've been much more subservient to Putin and his regime, but they still have been oppositional. So they opposed the pension reforms that Putin brought in about 6 or 7 years ago, and they also importantly opposed the constitutional reform process and the constitutional reforms that were put into place in 2020, 3 years ago. So the Communist Party is an interesting example. The Communist Party has generally supported the war in Ukraine and the leadership of Zyuganov. But there are members of the regional Communist Party, and particularly in Primorsky Krai, who have actually spoken out against it. They were immediately removed from the party. But we do see within the Communist Party that there is some dissent about this war. And there was a very interesting case in Moscow where an individual named Mikhail Lobanov, who was essentially supported by the Communist Party in the Duma elections, he's come out very strongly against the war. So there are some members, I think, of the Communist Party of Russia or others of this, what the Russians call the left, which, it's a systematic opposition group. It's generally pretty subservient, but there are some members, at least on generational and on regional lines, who themselves might be opposed and who have actually put their heads above the parapet and suggested that they're opposed to the war. So I do think we can't dismiss the systematic opposition completely, even though 95% of them are largely following the line and are pro-war. The other party that I think merits some discussion is the Yabloko Party, which is the old liberal party in the 1990s set up by Grigory Yavlinsky, who's still in place. Grigory Yavlinsky, who is the head, is kind of taking this kind of straddle line. He's kind of against the war, but he's not. But the younger members of the Yabloko Party have been very openly against the war, some of whom have are facing charges. And I do think that the Yabloko Party, which actually, interestingly, Alexei Navalny was a member of before he started his own movement, the Yabloko Party is an interesting example of an opposition party that exists in Russia, has not yet been banned. Now, there's some rumors that it will be banned in the coming months. That might happen, who knows? But it still remains active and legal for the time being. So I think, and they've been considered a kind of systematic opposition group. So I think we need to kind of think about them as well, because we'll talk later in this panel about what might happen in any future kind of regime transition. But I do think we can't discount members, particularly younger members of these groups or members of these parties that are in the regions that might themselves have very oppositional ideas and have maybe said some things, but have been careful about other things. They might play important roles in understanding the and in actually forming a new Russia. So I think we should think about them as an important part of the opposition. Another group that I'm a lawyer myself that I think is a really interesting group that there's some overlap with, particularly with the Yabloko party, are human rights lawyers, constitutional rights lawyers. Many of them are naturally oppositional because of the way in which the regime essentially ignores the constitutional provisions on rights, and have found themselves, thinking, well, geez, how can we stand up and actually, enforce rights in courts? So as a result, you're actually getting lawyers and groups of lawyers. Again, some of them now have left, others are facing charges, but the lawyers themselves and human rights lawyers have found themselves to be actually part of the opposition as well. So we should even think about legal groups as a part of the opposition. So I'll pass it along to the other, because there's a whole lot of other parts of the opposition, but that's just two components which I think are interesting to watch and to see what will happen in the coming years.
Yeah, I just want to underscore this, the importance of the generational divide in Russian politics. There are definitely younger members of the systemic parties who are using those parties as vehicles for their political careers. There's definitely lots of problems, internal problems in Russia. And we had many years of the Kremlin trying to impose a very strong rule over all the parties, all the systemic opposition, but then the problems are not getting addressed. So people look at options, what they have. They see failed attempts of Alexei Navalny to register his party. He tried 9 times and he was denied registration. So they look at other parties, minor parties, and they see that as an opportunity to actually get a voice. And they do manage to, some of the brighter figures like Nikolai Bondarenko, Mikhail Labanov or Mikhail Matveyev, they have been able to actually get some popular support and recognition. They are, so definitely in the Russia after Putin, they will play a role. They fly under the radar of the Western audiences because they really play within the Russian sphere. But I think Russian politics is going to be much more complicated. So, Robert, you've done some research. You've been quite interested in the broader Russian opposition, and you've in the NGO space and other organizations. Who would you like to include as kind of the leading figures of the Russian opposition, broader Russian opposition?
Okay, thanks. I suppose one thing that is worth reflecting on is just the problem of the very term opposition. Opposition exists in Western democracies where you have people who are organized against the governments and their existence is tolerated on some level. Even in hybrid authoritarian regimes such as Russia was until maybe 2018, there were political opponents who functioned within the system and who could compete in elections, and sometimes they could be elected to local councils. Russia today isn't like that. There is no space for opposition in a sense that we understand the term having political meaning. And I sometimes think that the term resistance, in the sense that there was a resistance to Nazi Germany, there was no political opposition in Nazi Germany. That is the point that Russia is approaching now, is the repression that Putin's unleashed since the beginning of the war is changing the way that people resist the regime. As far as what this resistance is, and I suppose I understand it as a network that unites a lot of people who have personal connections that have been formed whilst resisting Putin for the past 20 years. And first, there are people who've been engaged in politics and political movements that are now banned, but who have acquired a public profile as a result of that. Figures like Navalny, figures like Ilya Yashin, figures like Vladimir Karamurza and Yevgeny Roizman. If there were free elections today in Russia, they would be major contenders. They would have a national profile. The discussion would be which ministries they would occupy. Then there are activists from civil society, from the NGOs that were allowed to exist under increasingly repressive conditions, but they were able to function, they were able to exist as spaces for the expression of alternative views and for the public discussion. Organizations like Memorial, Russia's most important human rights organization, which derived its energy from the fact that it was both engaged in the protection of human rights and the investigation of the dark side of the Soviet past. And that combination gave it an authenticity in Russian society, because the anguish that exists in so many Russian families about how those families had been had suffered under the Soviet regime, that provided a motive for fighting for human rights in the present. Memorial is a very important organization in Russia, and it's one of the few NGOs that exists as a national organization. It has branches throughout the country. It's now outlawed. And this morning, literally hours ago, Russian anti-extremism police, Putin's political police, raided the homes of most of the leaders of Memorial in Moscow, including the home of Jan Rotchinsky, who several months ago gave a very impressive speech in Stockholm on the occasion of Memorial's receipt of the Nobel Peace Prize. Third, there are various groups that are connected with cultural and intellectual subcultures. There's a youth movement called Vyesna that's currently organizing sort of clandestine protests against the war around Russia. They print placards and put them in the lifts of apartment buildings. They stage things that are designed to leave marks in public space that there is resistance to the war, that there are people who are hostile to the war. And finally, there are a group of important media structures which all have origins in Russia and which now function outside of Russia. The TV station Dozhd, which is extremely important. It's YouTube reports every evening. The number of viewers is in the 400,000s, 500,000s, 600,000s, 700,000s, most of those in Russia. The newspaper Novaya Gazeta, which is now being produced in Europe, the investigative news websites, Insider and Medusa. All of those are part of this broader resistance to the Putin regime and to Putin's war in Ukraine. And they're all part of a broader network. There are lots of people who've moved from one of those groups to another as circumstances have changed. For instance, Russia's human rights movement, which was relatively small at the beginning of the Putin regime, became larger and larger with each passing year as more people went from being involved in democratic politics to becoming human rights activists. A whole series of democratic politicians went from competing in elections to defending human rights. And equally, there are a whole series of people who are very active in civil society who've become investigative journalists and who are part of that alternative media. Thanks.
Thank you, Robert. And I'd like to add a few words about the uniqueness of Alexei Navalny's movement. So as I mentioned, he tried to register a political party 9 times and was denied 9 times, but yet he still has the largest and most effective political organization of all the parties in Russia. When he ran for president in 2017, 2018, his team opened up regional headquarters in 45 cities around Russia. Each opening was packed with people. He toured Russia. There were literally thousands of people who would come out to those events. And this regional network, even after his failed presidential bid, it still remained until it was formally pronounced an extremist organization last year. But this regional network was extremely vibrant and strong. And we could see how powerful it was when Alexei Navalny came back to Russia after recovering from his poisoning. I remember that winter of the January of 2021, the political atmosphere in Russia seemed to be completely dead. There was no indication of any potential protests, and lots of people thought that was a suicidal idea of Navalny going back to Russia, and they didn't expect anything to happen. And what we saw is a huge uprising all over Russia. It wasn't just in Moscow. For several weekends, there were protests in dozens of cities around Russia. It shows it's not just the power of Alexei Navalny's charisma, which is important, but it's also that network of local organizers, activists. Many of them had to leave Russia, but then Navalny's team is still trying to rekindle that, recreate that network under the current oppressive regime. So I think they will certainly have a role to play. And unlike other opposition organizations in exile, they probably have the strongest network still within Russia. Moving on from this,
So just briefly to say, one of the things that I think the Kremlin fears most is, and the reason why I think Navalny became, and they have obviously tried to poison him, tried to kill him, and they have so systematically tried to destroy his movement, is because of this regional reach. Right, this is the first significant member of the opposition to reach beyond Moscow. And I think the Kremlin was okay with saying we can manage Moscow-based opposition amongst the intellectuals, whatever. But once it starts spreading, that's when they start to worry, because one of the concerns they have is, all the money is centralized in Moscow. You go out to the regions of Russia, they're not getting the money that Moscow has. They're not getting the nice parks. They're not getting the management by a good manager like Sobyanin. They're increasingly growing impoverished. So the concerns are that an opposition movement that actually has regional roots is actually a real threat. And I think, what's interesting to see is when Navalny starts getting followed by his assassins is this 2017, when he starts to run for president. And we'll see next week when Leonid Volkov, his political advisor and kind of chief of staff at the time, built this massive regional support group or support of these headquarters. That's really significant. So I think just to bolster Piotr's point there, this is a really important aspect of, and the first time we've seen in opposition politics support that goes beyond Moscow in a really meaningful way. And I think that is a really important aspect of the Navalny movement that I think sets it apart from other groups that we can talk about.
Thank you. Thank you for supporting that point, William. I think it would be worth very briefly touching upon the main challenges to anti-Putin opposition, besides the obvious oppressive regime and all the laws that are in place. But Robert, you wanted to say a few words about kind of internal challenges that the Russian opposition is facing as well.
Okay, well, I think there are basically three fundamental challenges that the Russian opposition needs to overcome. The first is to establish a minimum level of unity and collaboration. One of the lessons of the colored revolutions in the former Soviet space is that they've succeeded when opposition leaders have put aside their rivalries, their ambitions, their mutual grievances and ideological differences, and focused on the need to remove the dictatorship. That they've set that first goal and they've postponed many other things. And equally, one of the fundamental lessons of the past 2 decades of Putin's dictatorship is that it's been founded on the politics of divide and rule. It's bought people off, it's set people against each other. Every time there's some kind of an effort to unite the opposition, it's devoted vast resources to splitting that initiative and to provoking conflict. So bringing down the Putin regime will require compromises, it will require alliances, and it will require the suspension of conflicts within the opposition that are just politically not necessary now. Now, it's clear that there are some things that you can't compromise about. For instance, I think it's unlikely that the mainstream opposition could find common ground with a figure like Ilya Ponomaryov, who's been getting quite a lot of coverage in British tabloids. He's a Russian politician who immigrated to Ukraine, and he now sees himself as a revolutionary. He's the head of a series of initiatives that he sees as aimed at the violent overthrow of the Russian state and the destruction of the Russian state as such. I can't imagine the mainstream opposition will find common ground with him, but there are many figures in the opposition who are divided by small things, not big things, and they've got to put the small things to one side. The second fundamental challenge is communicating with the Russian population living in Russia at a time when a lot of those who were opposed to the Putin regime have gone into exile to avoid arrest and imprisonment and the destruction of their lives. This is a divide that the Putin regime and its propagandists is exploiting. Russian TV every night has something about those exiles who are enjoying a nice lifestyle in the West and who are betraying us and who are conspiring with our enemies and who are part of the dastardly plans of the CIA to use Nazis to enslave Russia. This sounds delusional, but it highlights a problem that those in exile aren't sharing the ordeals of those who are living under increasingly totalitarian conditions in Russia itself. One challenge is to address those in Russia with a certain compassion and understanding for the difficult moral choices they are making. There are many Russians who are silent because they are worried about what speaking out will mean for their small children or for parents or for other loved ones. There are many people who are making difficult moral choices, and showing an understanding of that is really important. And finally, I think the Russian opposition needs to find a way to confront the stereotypes about Russia, those stereotypes that we discussed at the beginning about Navalny, but more broadly about all Russians loving Putin, all of Russian history being a continuum of tyranny, about there being no possibility of a more free, more humane, and more democratic Russia. These are prejudices that have a long history in Western thought. They can arguably be traced back to the French intellectual, the Marquis de Custine, who traveled to Russia in 1841 and who announced to the world in this famous book that the Russians were nothing more than regimented Tatars. And today, similar prejudices are being widely circulated amongst many Western commentators and so-called experts who don't actually read Russian, but they pretend to know. These prejudices are very problematic, and they're very harmful. They reinforce the fundamental pillars of the Putin regime's propaganda about the identity, the unity of the leader and the Russian population. They're also used by Russian propagandists to show that all Westerners hate Russians as such, that the outside world is saying that we are evil, that it's not just an authoritarian regime, but it is every ordinary Russian is despised by the West. And every time one of these statements is made by a Western commentator, it's on Russian propaganda that evening. And finally, it's very dangerous because there are people who are engaged in policymaking, people in government, people who are advising governments, who are susceptible to these prejudices, to these oversimplifications. And the real danger is that they allow those prejudices to inform the making of the policies of Western governments.
Thank you, Robert. You've spoken very eloquently on this, on the main challenges that the opposition is facing. The only thing I would add is the difficulty of communication for the Russian opposition with people in Russia. It's so much easier to communicate with the Western audience because it's available, but at the same time, the over-communication with the West can actually lead to alienation from the Russian people. And fundamentally, these opposition leaders who are in exile especially, they will need to find a way of getting support inside of Russia. And when they're being scrutinized at all times, all of their messages, everything they say when they address the Russian people, they're being constantly watched. And everything they say can be blown out of proportion or put in the wrong context. And we had the example of the Dorst TV station where a couple of instances where an anchor showed too much compassion towards the Russian people. And that blew up into a major scandal that led eventually to the revocation of the broadcasting license in Latvia. So it's an extremely challenging environment to operate in, facing this not only repression from the Putin's regime, but also constant scrutiny in the West as well, especially in Eastern Europe and from Ukrainians, understandably. I think it would be good to finish on a brighter note and think about the possible transitions from Putin's rule. How can we, what sort of future can we imagine? What's after Putin's regime?
Okay.
Well,
yeah, so I mean, with all the caveats about not trying to predict what happens in Russia, which is always a dangerous thing to do. I mean, I think there are a couple scenarios that could take place. Some of them which are positive, or are very bright and positive, and maybe I'll leave those to the end. But a few that are not so much. One is we can imagine this regime will go into crisis, right? That there's no question about that. At some point, crisis will be engendered by Putin's leaving office. He'll leave office either because he dies or because he's pushed out in a palace coup, likely. So at some stage that will happen. And then what's next? Well, I mean, one is we have just the complete status quo. Another war hawk comes in, assuming the war is continuing, which I think it will. I mean, my view, people are calling this the long war already. I expect this war to continue for years and years and years, and the regime to go into crisis before the war ends, I think. So on that regard, we can have another war hawk. So a Patrushev or someone like that takes over and we don't see any real change. That's not a particularly positive outcome. Another is a kind of middle outcome, which is a regime crisis and a technocrat comes in. Now, one of the key elements of the Russian regime pre-invasion and even pre-2018 is that it's always had a huge class of bureaucrats slash technocrats who are actually extremely good at what they do. And many of them, I think, are opposed to this war. They want to get on with the business of what they see as doing, of solving problems. They're not actually themselves particularly committed to democracy, but they're committed to management, right? They're managerialist kind of individuals. And so we can see someone like, for instance, the current prime minister who's raising his profile, Mikhail Mishustin, he could take over, right? Someone like that. So we could have a technocrat. Now that provides, and I expect to get legitimacy, they might try to engage with certain members of the opposition. He might release Alexei Navalny from prison. He might invite the Navalny team back in to work with him. That will pose potential issues and problems for the opposition. To what extent do they work with this group? I think that would be a really, and there's going to be a lot of gray areas. There's going to be and I think that will present many of the problems that Robert's talking about. How does the opposition kind of have a united front when potentially they're getting picked off by a technocratic successor to Putin? And the final one is the kind of colored revolution model where the whole regime collapses and you get a fundamental reconstruction. And that is what I think we're starting to see in the Washington Post article that Robert mentioned. Navalny, as well as Khodorkovsky and his movement have started to talk about Russia kind of changing its constitutional setup, right? And I think that's important, moving away from this highly presidentialized system to more of a parliamentary system. Something like that can be seen as a possible opportunity, but this is the one I think is the most potentially hopeful, and where you're going to see the opposition itself, hopefully in competitive elections, then the opposition can compete with each other, right? For actual kind of open politics and pluralistic politics. Now, that is a more, I think, quite an optimistic, maybe a less likely outcome, but still a possible outcome. And of course, one thing that we need to be thinking about, and I think as we talk about the opposition but in the West or even amongst Russians, is thinking about this, because Putin is not going to be there forever. And I think thinking about what comes next and how this is negotiated is very much at the forefront of what the Navalny movement and numbers of the opposition are talking about. Also, Western governments who will be playing an important role in this as well, including Australia. So I think we need to be thinking about this and about how we do this. And on that note, I think it is positive in the sense that this won't go on forever. The Soviet Union eventually collapsed. This regime will collapse or will change, and how that changes is largely up to the opposition who we're talking.
Yeah, I just want to underscore the role that the West is going to play in the future of Russia. There's no question that Russia just doesn't have the same level of resources as the collective West has, and the West can play a very important formative role in whatever transition that takes place. Personally, as a Russian who is really committed to a democratic vision of my country, one of the scenarios that I'm most fearful about is the West compromising on its values of liberal democracy and deciding to strike some sort of deal with a technocrat or basically settling for a change of leadership from Putin to somebody else, but without fundamentally changing the regime, without insisting on the importance of the rule of law, free and fair elections, etc. So I do think that it is critically important for the West to actually insist on the future Russian government to commit to democratic reforms, proper democratic reforms, and really put controls in place and really kind of create both incentives and also, I guess, the stick would be the lifting of the sanctions will happen only in response to certain democratic elections, and then reintroduction to the kind of community of the Western countries only on condition of these democratic reforms taking place. So Russians will play a major role, but I want to underscore the important role that the West will play in the transformation of Russia. Thank you.
All right, brilliant. Thank you so much to our incredible and incredibly insightful panel, I might add as well. Round of applause, please, for the three of them for joining us this evening. Before we wrap up, we will do a quick Q&A. So for those that can hear me but not see me online, please feel free to add those in the Q&A section in the Zoom webinar. But I'm going to jump into the floor straight away with Richard, our president, who's going to start with our first question.
Thanks very much. I found that incredibly interesting. One of the things we haven't talked about as a potential source of resistance, and I like that term, is the Russian army. Of course, in 1917, it was the army that rebelled after a great deal of moral damage in the First World War. Is there any possibility that today's army might rebel in the same sort of way?
Okay, well, there are several aspects of this problem. One is that there is real tension between the Russian armed forces and the Wagner group, the mercenaries owned by Putin's friend, the oligarch Yevgeny Prigozhin. That is a source of potential serious inter-elite conflict that could precipitate the breakdown of the regime. Second, there clearly is very significant discontent within some within the ranks of the Russian army. Leonid Volkov, who'll be here next week, today he posted on Twitter a statement that there had been an increase in the number of videos released on Telegram from soldiers in different parts of the front saying conditions here are completely hopeless. This is a joke. We can't continue like this. So certainly the army is a potential source of problems for the regime itself. It's also a problem because the army is connected to millions of Russian families. Millions of Russian families have sons and fathers and husbands who are in the armed forces, and they are hearing how bad things are. And that ultimately can also have very serious consequences for the regime.
Kind of comment on this as well. I think you're less likely to see the army itself and the leadership in the army overthrow the regime. You're not likely, I think you're very unlikely to see a kind of military coup. But as Robert's saying, I think what you're more likely to see is the army, the military becomes the microcosm, right, of how poorly Russian institutions are functioning. Right? The Russian military is corrupt. The Russian military is throwing its young people essentially into this meat grinder. And you know that as the war goes on, that's going to become more apparent. And I think it will become more, and you're starting to see some organizations, you know, the organization of war mothers are starting to really become more and more vocal. So I think, you know, we could see the army itself and the decay, right? Because of course this army this was a military that had been talked up prior to 24th of February as one of the great militaries of the world, and it's shown itself to be lacking in many respects. And I think as Russians see that, they're going to start to see, well, actually, there is a point to the message that the opposition is saying that, you know, this is supposed to be a strong government, but look at it, it's weak, it's corrupt, it's unable to actually function, it's unable to carry out basic, you know, efforts of taking over a much smaller country, neighboring country. It's also unable to essentially provide for its people. So I think that it could be, because the military, I think, in the army will play an important role as a microcosm of these broader problems with how the regime is essentially decaying from the inside.
I'm going to jump in real quick with a question from our Zoom audience from Penelope Wensley, who's asked for any comment from the panelists about the current Russia-China relationship and how this could affect things moving forward. Obviously, with the meeting that's recently happened, this is quite pressing on a lot of people's minds. So any sort of elaboration, please.
I can venture a response. I think it's a very dangerous but predictable development that China will lend its support to Russia. Personally, I don't think that the military support is likely. I think it's going to be the type of support is going to be more economic. I think China really benefits from the current situation. The weak Russia, it probably wants to prolong the current situation for as long as possible, where Putin is not able to sell the natural resources of the country to the West. All the Western markets are cut off. So he has to completely reorient towards China, India, and other countries. So I think the economic interests of China will outweigh, and it will try to freeze the conflict for as long as possible. So the China will try to broker some sort of peace deal, which will likely include Russia keeping the territories it already invaded, occupied, which is not going to be tenable in the long course, but in long term. But this is certainly a dangerous development, and I think it's in this context, it's important that the West helps Ukraine achieve some military kind of victories and actually shake the Putin's regime and prevent it from really congealing in this current form. With the help of China.
Just very briefly, I mean, China has this peace plan. If you read China's peace plan, point one is the respect of territorial integrity, right? Which, of course, that would mean that the Russians would have to pull their troops out of the sovereign country of Ukraine. So the whole thing is, I don't think the Chinese are serious at all about a peace plan, but I do think you're right. Like, it's an axis of convenience, and it is convenient for the Chinese for this conflict to continue. It's what they would call probably a win-win. They're getting cheap gas, and they've got the West engaged in Ukraine. And so look, I think that, it plays into the interests of the Chinese, and that there's the strategic partnership with Russia, which is only strategic. They share no values, and they share a very long border which is going to be, say, 50, 60 years down the track. There are a lot of low-level technocrats in the Russian Ministry of Foreign Ministry who are very concerned about actually what's going to happen with Siberia. The Chinese are looking at Siberia quite, they need land, they need agricultural land, and so forth. So look, it's not a strong relationship. It's not an unlimited friendship, as they call it, but it is certainly a strategic one now. And so I agree with you.
We've only got a couple minutes left, and I have one last question from our Zoom audience. We might do a quick fire round answers from all our panelists, which is, do you think that the ICC arrest warrant will have any impact on Putin's regime or resistance within?
Oh, okay. Well, I think it is the beginning of the end for Putin. His usefulness to the Russian elite is partly his ability to represent the Russian state in its interaction with the world. When he becomes a pariah for a lot of the world, his usefulness to the elite, and whether that is the security elite or the economic elite or the kleptocrats around Putin, his usefulness has just been massively devalued. So I would be extremely surprised if he personally is in power in a year's time. Putin himself has become the main problem for the Russian elite today. That does not bode well for his political survival.
And I'd like to add to that, it makes it a lot more difficult for Western leaders like Macron to make any deals with Putin. Now it's just an untenable position to be making deals with a recognized criminal. So yeah, it's a good development. I not necessarily sharing the optimism that Putin will not outlive a year, but it's definitely a good development.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to also think that, I mean, Putin, he might hold on longer, but it certainly suggests it's a final nail in the coffin to the suggestion that there'll ever be a peace deal with Putin in power. It sends a very clear message about that. And maybe that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? So now it means that it's very clear to the Russian elite and to this technocratic elite that we've been talking about, who are not happy about this war and not happy about its direction and are concerned about its impact on the long-term future. And Putin himself is a 70-year-old man, but, you know, younger technocrats are like, what about our kids? What about our future? You know, I think they might be looking and thinking about, you know, post-Putin world now as much more as the only way out of this, right? And I think that's what this is doing. So I tend to agree that this is the end of any peace deal with and any kind of dream that I think, you know, Russian state media is always talking about, that Putin's going to sit down with Biden and Macron and maybe, you know, Rishi Sunak, and they're gonna hammer out a conclusion, and the poor Ukrainians are gonna have to follow. That's just not going to happen now, right? So it's going to have to be a post-Putin peace deal, or, you know, or Putin's going to push out in a palace coup or something like that. So, but the peace, there won't be peace in Ukraine until or unless Putin's gone.
Brilliant. We'll leave it there. Again, thank you so much for joining us this evening. If we can put our hands together one last time for our panel. That's also where we'll leave our Zoom audience, but for those here in the audience, feel free to stay and mingle. Thank you.